Imagine opening a map of the world. Europe is still there. China is still there. The United States is still there. But across the heart of Eurasia, something is missing. Not just a country, an entire historical power. No Russian Empire, no Soviet Union, no modern Russia as we know it. And suddenly, some of the biggest questions of modern history have no obvious answers. What happens to Poland and Eastern Europe? Who dominates Central Asia? Does Nazi Germany face an Eastern Front? Does the Cold War ever happen? And perhaps most importantly, what happens to the global economy when one of the world's biggest energy and commodity powers never rises? To answer that, we have to go back. Not to modern Russia, but to the point where Russian state power was still only one possible path. First, a crucial distinction. Russia did not simply appear one day. Eastern Slavic societies existed for centuries. The medieval polity known as Kievan Rus existed long before the modern Russian state. Later, the Grand Duchy of Moscow expanded and eventually became the core of a much larger state. In our thought experiment, we are not erasing these peoples from history. We are changing the political path. Imagine that Moscow never becomes the center of a vast Eurasian empire. Perhaps another regional power dominates. Perhaps the lands fragment among several states. Perhaps some territories fall under the influence of neighboring empires. The exact outcome is impossible to know. But one thing is certain. The Eurasian balance of power would be completely different. And nowhere would that be more obvious than in Europe. For centuries, Russia became one of the major forces shaping Eastern Europe. Its expansion affected Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually the entire European balance of power. Without that expansion, one plausible outcome is a stronger or longer-lasting Polish-Lithuanian sphere in parts of Eastern Europe. Sweden might face a different strategic environment. The Ottoman Empire could retain greater influence around the Black Sea, and the political map of the Balkans could evolve very differently. Then comes Napoleon. Historically, Russia became a major part of the coalition that eventually defeated Napoleon. But without a Russian great power, Napoleon's opponents would face a very different strategic problem. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and other European states would still exist, but the balance between them would change. Perhaps another coalition eventually defeats France. Perhaps Napoleon's empire lasts longer. Perhaps a completely different European order emerges. The point isn't that France automatically wins. It's that one of the continent's biggest strategic weights has disappeared, and that changes the entire game. Now look east. Historically, Russian expansion eventually crossed the Urals and spread deep into Siberia and Central Asia. That expansion connected enormous territories to one political center. Without it, the vacuum doesn't simply remain empty. Someone, or something, would eventually compete for influence. In Central Asia, possible contenders include Persia, China, the Ottoman world, and local states. In the Caucasus, the same question appears. Who controls the region between the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Persia, and Anatolia? And Siberia presents an even bigger mystery. Without Russian expansion, there is no obvious single state destined to control the enormous territory stretching across northern Eurasia. Some areas could remain under local rule. Others could become linked to China or other neighboring powers. European states might attempt limited expansion. Trade routes could develop differently. Even the idea of Eurasia itself, as one enormous political and economic space, could look completely different. And then history reaches the 20th century. That is where the consequences become explosive. Start with the First World War. Historically, Russia's entry into the war created the massive Eastern Front. Germany and Austria-Hungary had to fight a major enemy in the east while facing France and Britain in the west. Remove Russia as a great power, and that strategic equation changes immediately. Germany could potentially concentrate more resources against France. Austria-Hungary faces a different eastern frontier. The Ottoman Empire operates in a different strategic environment. But this does not mean Germany automatically wins. Britain still controls a huge maritime network. France remains a major industrial and military power. And the United States could still enter the conflict. The outcome becomes uncertain, not predetermined. Then comes the Second World War. This is perhaps the biggest military change of all. Without a Soviet Union, there is no Eastern Front in the form we know. No enormous German-Soviet war beginning in 1941. No Red Army advancing all the way to Berlin. No Soviet occupation of much of Eastern Europe after the war. Germany would face a radically different strategic environment. But again, one conclusion should be avoided. No Soviet Union does not automatically mean Nazi victory. Britain remains. The United States remains. Industrial production, naval power, resistance movements, and the war in the Mediterranean still matter. The entire conflict simply becomes much harder to predict. And if the Soviet Union never exists, the 20th century loses something even bigger than a military alliance. It loses an entire ideological superpower. The Russian Revolution never produces the Soviet state. That alone changes global politics. Soviet industrialization never happens in its historical form. Eastern Europe is not transformed into a Soviet-controlled bloc after World War II. And the ideological rivalry between American capitalism and Soviet communism never develops in the same way. So, does the Cold War happen? Probably not in the form we recognize. But rivalry between great powers would not disappear. The United States could still compete with other major powers. China could emerge differently. Japan could play a larger strategic role. A powerful European state, or a coalition of European states, could become another center of power. And China is especially interesting. The Chinese Communist movement developed from China's own political and social conditions, but the Soviet Union also played an important role in the international communist system. Without Moscow, Chinese communism would face a very different external environment. It might still rise, it might develop differently, or another political path could dominate China. Again, there is no guaranteed answer, but the world would almost certainly be less bipolar. And that has enormous economic consequences. Now we reach perhaps the most underrated consequence: resources. Modern Russia became one of the world's major producers and exporters of energy and commodities: oil, natural gas, metals, minerals, agricultural products, and enormous reserves across Siberia and the Arctic. If that Russian state never develops, those resources do not magically disappear. But their ownership, extraction, transportation, and political control could be completely different. Take natural gas. For decades, European economies became deeply connected to pipeline supplies from Russia. Without a Russian energy giant, Europe would have stronger incentives to develop alternative suppliers and infrastructure. Those alternatives could include Norway, the Middle East, North Africa, liquefied natural gas, and other sources. Energy prices could behave differently. European industry could develop differently. And investment in alternative energy technologies might happen earlier in some scenarios. But there is another possibility. If fewer resources are developed across northern Eurasia, global supply could sometimes be tighter. That could increase the strategic importance of producers in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the absence of Russia doesn't automatically mean cheaper energy. It means a completely different energy system. The same logic applies to minerals and agriculture. Russia and the territories historically incorporated into its state became important suppliers of many commodities. Without a single giant political authority controlling those networks, global trade could become more fragmented. And then there is the Arctic. Modern Russia possesses an enormous Arctic coastline. It has invested in Arctic infrastructure, shipping, resource extraction, and military capabilities. Without that Russian presence, Arctic competition would look very different. Canada, the United States, Norway, Denmark through Greenland, and possibly other powers could play larger roles. The Arctic might become less militarized in some scenarios, or it could become a new arena for competition, which brings us to the two powers that dominate today's global conversation: America and China. Would the United States become even more dominant without Russia? Possibly. The United States would face no Soviet superpower with a comparable nuclear arsenal, military reach, and ideological network. NATO might develop very differently. America might become the world's leading power with fewer strategic constraints. But there is a twist. Without Russia occupying the center of Eurasia, China could have opportunities that it never had historically. Central Asia might fall much more strongly into China's economic orbit. Trade routes across Eurasia could be organized around Chinese interests. And China's rise might begin to look less like a regional story, and more like the rise of the dominant power across the entire Eurasian continent. So instead of a 20th century defined by America versus the Soviet Union, perhaps the great strategic competition of the modern era becomes America versus China. Or perhaps Europe remains more powerful. Or perhaps Eurasia fragments into several competing centers. There is no single predetermined future. So what would this alternate world actually look like? Europe could have different borders and alliances. Poland and the states of Eastern Europe might occupy a very different strategic position. The Ottoman and Persian worlds might have evolved differently. Central Asia could be divided among local powers, or pulled toward China. Siberia might never become part of one enormous empire. World War I could follow a radically different path. World War II could be almost unrecognizable. The Soviet Union would never become a superpower. The Cold War, at least in its historical form, would disappear. Global energy markets would be reorganized. The Arctic would have a different strategic balance. And the United States and China might confront each other in a world where neither has to account for a Russian superpower. But there is one final lesson. Removing Russia from history doesn't simply remove one country. It removes, or transforms, the incentives that shaped countless other countries. Wars, alliances, borders, trade routes, energy systems, military strategies, political ideologies, economic decisions, all of them would react to the new reality. And that is why alternate history is so difficult. History is not a row of independent events. It is a web. Change one of its largest nodes, and the entire structure begins to move. Russia's greatest impact on history may not be the territory it controlled, the wars it fought, or the resources it exported. It may be the entire world that formed in response to its existence. And in a world where Russia never became the power we know today, the question isn't simply, who replaces Russia? The deeper question is, what kind of world would have formed without ever needing to?